Here's the story everyone already believes. Somewhere back in deep prehistory, an early human picked a handful of unfamiliar berries, ate them, and either lived or didn't. Repeat that a few thousand times across a few thousand people, and eventually you get a species that knows which plants are food. It's a tidy story. It's also almost certainly wrong. Wrong because most of the plants capable of killing you don't give you a second chance to update your data. A few berries from the wrong shrub, a handful of raw castor beans, a mouthful of the wrong mushroom. These aren't warnings, they're endings. A species that actually learned this way, one dead experimenter at a time, would have run out of experimenters long before it accumulated any wisdom worth passing on. So if reckless tasting wasn't the method, something else had to be doing the work. And once you start looking, it turns out ancient humans had built an entire overlapping system of safeguards long before anyone had a word for chemistry. The first safeguard wasn't learned at all. It was already wired in. Human infants, like most primates, are born reflexively rejecting anything intensely bitter, long before they've tasted a single poisonous plant. That's not a coincidence. Many of the most dangerous compounds a plant can produce, alkaloids, cyanide-releasing compounds, the chemical arsenal a plant builds because it would rather not be eaten, register on the tongue as bitterness. The mechanism isn't perfect. Some genuinely nutritious plants are bitter too, and some real poisons taste bland or even faintly sweet, which is exactly why bitterness alone was never trusted as the final word. But as a first filter, an automatic full-body flinch before conscious thought even arrives, it bought early humans something priceless, a reason to hesitate. Long before anyone could explain why, the body had already started arguing against the mouth. The second safeguard came from watching everyone else who was already eating. If birds stripped a bush clean and squirrels buried its seeds for winter, that plant earned tentative trust. Animals had been running their own version of this experiment for millions of years longer than humans had existed, and their choices were free data. But this method had a real blind spot. An animal's tolerance is not a human's tolerance. Birds gorge on berries and seeds that would kill a person outright, because their metabolisms handle the same toxins differently. So animal behavior became a hint, never a verdict. Useful for narrowing thousands of unfamiliar plants down to a short list, useless as final proof. Nature's approval was a lead worth following, never a signature worth trusting blindly. Where a plant survived the first two filters, a third took over. Touch it to the lip, chew a fragment and spit it out, rub the sap on the inside of the wrist, and wait. Accounts of foraging cultures that still practice traditional plant knowledge describe exactly this kind of graduated exposure. Skin, then lip, then a token taste, then, only after real waiting, an actual small swallow. With hours or even a full day between each step, because plenty of plant toxins take that long to announce themselves. It's slow by design. A method built for finding out you're wrong before you're wrong in a way you can't undo. What looks to modernize like superstition, all the waiting, all the small rituals around a new plant, was, more often than not, a home-built toxicology lab, running one cautious trial at a time. And the caution didn't stop once a plant passed the test. Preparation had to be repeated exactly. The same cut, the same soak, the same season. Because a plant that was safe prepared one way could still be dangerous prepared another. Consistency was itself part of the safety. Sometimes the plant wasn't the problem, the raw plant was. Cassava root, a staple across huge parts of the tropics, contains cyanide-producing compounds in its natural state. Eaten raw and unprepared, it can be dangerous, and yet it went on to feed entire regions. The trick wasn't finding a version without the poison. It was discovering that grating, soaking, and fermenting the root for days would leach the toxin out before it ever reached a plate. Acorns tell a similar story from a different continent. Bitter, tannin-loaded, barely edible straight off the tree. transformed by repeated leaching in running water into a genuine dietary staple for people across California and elsewhere. This is arguably the single biggest leap in the whole story. Humans didn't just learn which plants to eat. They learned how to argue a plant out of being poisonous. Long before taste ever entered the picture, smell was already voting. Many toxic plants and fungi carry an acrid or simply wrong-feeling odor that primate brains are tuned to flag as a warning before conscious reasoning gets involved. The same reflex that makes you recoil from spoiled food without needing to taste it first. It isn't foolproof. Some of the most dangerous mushrooms in the world smell pleasant, even faintly sweet, which is exactly why foragers still cite smell alone as a trap for the careless. But paired with everything else, sight, texture, the company a plant was found growing among, smell added one more vote in a system that was never built to rely on any single sense. None of this would have mattered if it died with the person who learned it. The actual engine behind this whole system wasn't any individual's cleverness. It was memory that outlived the individual. Knowledge about which roots to avoid, which berries needed days of soaking, which mushroom looked almost exactly like its lethal twin, got folded into taboo, myth, and ritual precisely because those forms are what a culture reliably repeats without fail, generation after generation, long after the original reasoning behind them is forgotten. A rule that says this plant is cursed survives centuries of retelling in a way a footnote never would. Researchers studying oral foraging traditions keep finding the same pattern. The stories aren't decoration wrapped around the knowledge. The stories are the storage system. A child who grew up hearing which grove was forbidden and why never had to test that ground personally. The whole point of the taboo was to make the lesson inheritable without repeating the tragedy that taught it. Here's the part that actually rescues the original theory. Trial and error was real. It just wasn't happening inside one lifetime. Spread across thousands of foragers, testing thousands of plants over hundreds of generations, filtered by every safeguard above, and passed forward only when it survived being wrong, trial and error becomes something closer to slow, brutal, unpaid science. Errors still get made, but they get made once per lineage, not once per person. What looks from a distance like instinct or intuition about plants is usually the compressed residue of an enormous number of earlier mistakes nobody living today ever had to personally repeat. The individual forager rarely discovered anything. The species did, over and over, and then simply handed the answer down. Not every method that emerged was reliable, and it's worth being honest about the ones that weren't. Across many unrelated cultures, healers converged on something like the doctrine of signatures, the idea that a plant's shape hints at its use, a walnut resembling a brain, a red sap resembling blood. Occasionally, this folk logic pointed towards something a modern pharmacologist would recognize as genuinely active. Far more often, it didn't, and the belief persisted anyway, propped up by memorable coincidences rather than results. It's a useful reminder that this whole system was never a flawless ancestral science. It was a patchwork of methods that mostly worked, occasionally didn't, and got revised, slowly and unevenly, whenever it failed badly enough to be noticed. Which brings the story back to that first handful of berries. They were never eaten blind. By the time anyone put them in their mouth, that decision had already been filtered through inherited reflex, borrowed animal behavior, cautious ritual, hard-won technique, and centuries of stories that existed for exactly this reason. No single method on this list would have been enough on its own. That's precisely why there were so many of them, stacked and overlapping, each one catching what the others missed. It wasn't one clever trick that kept ancient humans alive long enough to become us. It was a net, woven over thousands of years, out of everything a species could afford to remember.